welcome to the Russian accent. So today we're going to be sort of expanding everyone's overton window when it comes to Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because a lot of Western, people in the West, people who consume English or English-speaking, French-speaking, German-speaking media, whatever, it doesn't really matter what the language is, I frequently have certain misconceptions. And I'm not talking just people who sort of like against Putin, against Russia, versus people who tend to support Putin or understand Putin and so forth. I'm talking like everybody, okay? There is misconceptions in the West about what Ukraine is. So I'm just going to expand a little bit the Overton window, hopefully. Now, let's just start with the premise that people, for example, like Jeffrey Sachs, who sort of trying to understand that he goes into the explanations about the causes of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, Russo Ukrainian conflict. He talks a lot about the geopolitics of it, the promises made, the promises broken, the agreements signed, and agreements torn up. I mean, generally, I 100% agree with Jeffrey Sachs. I really have no problem with his narrative. That's totally fine. And yet, Jeffrey Sachs does betray a little bit of lack of understanding and knowledge. And I'm not faulting him for that, because Jeffrey Sachs is not from Soviet Union. He's not from Ukraine. He's not from Russia. He doesn't really understand these issues. And sometimes he presents them in a little bit distorted manner. So when Jeffrey Sachs, for example, is talking about Putin defending Russian speakers in Ukraine, this is a little bit incorrect. I would not never term, because, for example, even today, the majority of Russian speakers in Ukraine probably don't want to be defended by Putin. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but this is just a fact. And Putin is not necessarily defending any particular ethnicity, whether Russian or Russo Ukrainian or some Ukrainians or whatever. This is just a misnomer. The language is effectively a substitute for political opinion here. So Putin is defending, if you could say defending, effectively those who support his political line. We could say, well, in southeastern Ukraine, there are a lot of people who do support Putin. Okay, I'm not saying they're majority necessarily, but there's a large number of people who support him, particularly in like the Luhansk, Donetsk Republic, for sure in Crimea, in places like that. So there are a lot of people sympathetic, but it's not really the matter of the language as such. So in other words, to portray it as a sort of an ethnic, sort of language-related issues is incorrect. Okay, so this is from the perspective of more, let's say, pro-Putin camp, or at least Putin, as Germans say, Putin verstehe. Does it mean like somebody who understands Putin? Okay, now from the other perspective, from the people who sort of support Ukraine wholeheartedly and have Ukrainian flags hanging out the windows, the avatars, and so forth, they usually perceive this conflict as if there's a strict divide between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. They think there's this line, and that line goes right along the line on the map between the two countries that separates one people from another. It is if like La Manche, the La Manche Straits separate England from France. It's sort of like a distinctive line that on this side of the line there's this type of people with this type of customs and language, and on this side we have a different set of people with completely different religion and different sets of values. This is completely incorrect. But that's what a lot of Westerners believe. They believe that the Ukrainian is sort of a one thing and the Russian and one thing. This is why I am bringing this whole discussion about Russo Ukrainians and who these people are. Okay, I'll give you just a sort of anecdote, because again, when I was growing up, we kind of innately understood that, because our culture was so mixed. We were in my city, central Ukraine, Dnepropetrovsk, predominantly most people spoke Russian. But it is not to say that Ukrainian was not spoken, or at least versions of Ukrainian. There were different mixtures of different languages. So the market where people came from the countryside, you could hear more Ukrainian interwoven with Russians, which is sort of like it's a bit of a country dialect around where we're from. And this country dialect is called Suzhik. This is basically sort of a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. Once in a while, you'll hear people even with more pronounced Ukrainian expression. But this is all to say, just before I sort of get into this whole conversation, is that I'm not against any language at all. I'm not. I favor all the languages and favor as many languages as possible, and people should be free to use as many languages that they use. And the more they use, the better. So I have no qualms whatsoever. This is not a video about sort of like, oh, one has to favor one language or the other. Presumably, since I use the term Russo Ukrainian, one should be using favoring Russian language over Ukrainian or ethnic divide on that basis. It's not about it at all. Okay, so when I was growing up, we all were sort of well aware of this mix. You know, when you came to my hometown 40, 50 years ago, nobody would say this is a Russian town or this is a Ukrainian town. No, I was like, okay, you could say it's the town in the middle of the Ukrainian USSR. So clearly it's sort of Ukrainian town. But on the other hand, everybody, vast majority of people spoke Russian. Majority of people spoke Russian in Kiev, which was the capital of the Ukrainian USSR at the time. Now, there are different processes that led to that. It's not to say that it was entirely sort of a generic choice of the people. There were obviously pressures that came from the very top as to what language was used and so forth. But we'll get into it a little bit more. But in general, what we're talking about is a really mixed society. There's like, it was impossible to say who was Russian, who was Ukrainian. Of course, we know what a Russian name sounds like, what a Ukrainian name sounds like. Yes, we do know that there is sort of distinction, but the names in themselves don't tell the story, because a lot of families were completely mixed. They had, like, in my own family, I had a Russian part of the family, a Ukrainian part of the family. Now, most of my side of the family, my personal side, is Jewish, but again, it's all just part of the same world. It's not something that was distinct. Okay, so we were growing up with that, and we knew about it. And of course, we also knew that if you went to Western Ukraine, for example, then you would hear much less Russian and much more Ukrainian. In fact, if you went to countryside in Western Ukraine, it would be exclusively Ukrainian. And the Ukrainian spoken there would not be exactly Ukrainian spoken in the countryside around us. So it would be different kind of Ukrainian, even type of language that much closer to Polish in some ways. So this is just was the nature of the beast. Okay, so we understood that. But even that, with all the understanding, I grew up in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Ukraine predominantly. I was aware of all these things. Once I went to work as a translator in Western Ukraine, but a very particular region of Western Ukraine is called Zakarpattia, which is beyond the Carpathian Mountains. Okay, I went to that region. I had in my sort of simple mind as I was growing up, I thought I was just going to another part of Western Ukraine. In fact, I took the train from Lviv to the Carpathia region where I was going, and Lviv was distinctly Ukrainian. I mean, it was just like just about everyone was speaking Ukrainian on the street. It was the sort of clearly the language franca in that part of the country. So my expectation was, wow, I was just going to Zakarpattia. What do I know? It's just they're all gonna be just like Ukrainians, like Lviv. Great. So I got there, and then I got there in the evening. In the morning, I went to the factory where I was working as a translator, and I was talking to people on the floor, translating for some of the Americans and English who were there. And the people on the floor, local people, they were speaking Russian to me with hardly any accent at all. I mean, they sounded exactly like I sound myself. So they were just like talking to me in Russian, not a problem. And then we went to the lunchroom. And in the lunchroom, these people started talking the language. I had no idea what they were saying. And I was completely lost. I could hardly understand a single word, let alone the content of the conversation. And they're sort of asking, so what's this about? What are you actually speaking? And they say Ukrainian. And I'm like, this is not Ukrainian. I mean, I understand Ukrainian, but this is not Ukrainian. Okay, they said, yeah, well, it's not Ukrainian, it's a Ruthenian. Okay, so there were Ruthenian people, and when I asked him what is this Ruthenian, they told me, well, it's actually sort of like one of the ancient Russian dialects. Imagine, that's beyond the Carpathian Mountains, near the borders of Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania, and they have an ancient Russian dialect spoken there. Okay, but the dialect I could not understand. Okay, so I was very surprised. I was like, "Oh, I never heard of that. That's very interesting." Okay, so then I started researching a little bit more, and of course, as the Russo-Ukrainian conflict came to the fore over the last, let's say, 20 years or so, I became even more interested in this topic. Who are these people? Why they're there? What do they speak? How do they refer to themselves? Okay, so now we're gonna sort of look at the modern map of the Ukrainian state, and then we're gonna sort of draw the parallels from history, and understand where their identities come from. generally. Now, there's going to be a bit of a skip and a jump over history of Ukraine and Russia, so it's not going to be in depth at all. I'm not. This is not the intent of the video. I just want to emphasize how it all was formed. Okay, so now we're going back to the modern Ukraine. Okay, imagine the map of modern Ukraine. Imagine breaking Ukraine kind of like in three parts. So you have the very sort of western, like northwestern part of Ukraine. Okay, we'll call it Western Ukraine for simplicity. Now imagine you have a center, so anywhere from Kiev going down to almost like to Zaporozhye. Okay, so from Kiev to Zaporozhye and kind of westwards and a little bit eastwards. Okay, that's kind of like the center, right along the river Dnieper. Okay, and then you have the southeastern Ukraine, which is a sort of a vast region that goes all the way from, let's say, Kharkov, Luhansk, all the way to Odessa. It's kind of like a sort of a serpent, and it kind of resembles actually where the Russian forces currently occupying Ukrainian territory. That's exactly where they are. And then you have Crimea in the south, right? So let's consider how all this developed and why I'm speaking about this Russo-Ukrainian identity as if, for some people it's completely unknown. They don't understand. They think, like I said, I have like some French friends who like till they blue in the face, they're gonna be persuading me that there's such a thing as distinct Ukrainian identity that starts right at the border, and there's a Russian Ukrainian identity just eastwards of that, and this is the identities that are fighting each other. It's not exactly how it is. Okay, so we go back to the sort of formation of the ancient Russian state. Now, ancient Russian state, it was it's a state, it was an agglomeration of various Slavic tribes. Now, the Slavic tribes in general appear sort of in histories, one could say, around, excuse me, around 5th or 6th century Common Era, and they appear throughout the territories that are today, like Russia, Ukraine, all the way to the Balkans, where the Serbians are, and so forth. Where to the west you have Poland and Czechs and Slovaks and so forth. So that is sort of the appearance of Slavs. Now, with respect to the Eastern Slavs, the polity of Eastern Slavs uh, pretty much developed right around the 9th, 10th century. And that polity, now, there are many different stories in the origin of the Russian polity. When I speak of polity, I speak of different Eastern Slavic tribes. There's not like one per se name or anything like that. There's a multiple different tribes that live around in Kiev area, around Novgorod, and around modern, let's say, Pskov and Smolensk and places like that. So these tribes came to be ruled by a certain group of people. They're referring to sort of like a Rurik dynasty. And there's a big clash of arguments about where Ruriks came from. Now, the main sort of stream argument is the Ruriks were Swedes. Okay, so the Swedes, the Vikings, effectively the trading people, the pillaging people, came to rule the Slavic, let's say, primitive Slavic civilization that was primarily involved in agriculture. Okay, and this is named Rus or Russian later on. That name effectively comes, well, again, it is up to speculation, but the consensus probably tends to the idea that this name came from the Swedes, and the name means something like a rower or something like that. So the Swedes obviously were the Vikings were well traveled by sea and by river, and that's where they went by river, capturing all this sort of polities, uniting them and ruling them effectively. Of course, with passage of time, all the Swedes all they became Russian, so there's not much left of them. But the idea of the Rurik dynasty lasted all the way to Ivan the Terrible and his son. It was basically to the end of the 16th century. That's when it's ended effectively. Now, this polity, Ruriks developed eventually some sort of a state. It was called Kiev Rus, which is this, again, agglomeration of all these different duchies, small little duchies of people who were all related to the Rurik family, and they were ruling from. In fact, original seat of the Ruriks was in Novgorod, which is Russia today, but then they settled. The main seat became Kiev. Kiev became sort of the center of the civilization. But then it didn't really last long under various pressures from the west and, of course, from the east. So the Tatar, so-called Tatar-Mongol tribes. And so the Rurik state kind of splintered into various small duchies. And eventually, two larger polities came of it. Now, we're talking about 13th century roughly, okay? So in the 13th century, the polities that emerge at the Duchy of Lithuania. I know it sounds a bit strange because Lithuanians are not Slavs. So why am I talking about Lithuania? But anyway, just wait a bit. So you got two polities, Duchy of Moscow and Duchy of Lithuania. Okay. So Moscow, that's where agglomeration. Moscow obviously was within the confines of the Kiev Rus. So that's where the sort of the Eastern Slavs, the east part of the Eastern Slavs agglomerated around over the couple of centuries. Lithuanian state was a mixed state, so Lithuanians are indeed not Slavs. Their language origin, although they're from uh, the, uh, they're the same, they come from the also from the roots from Sanskrit language as well as all other Indo-European languages, but they're not Slavs. They're slightly different people, different customs and language, obviously not understood by the Slavs. But what happened is that Lithuania, when this whole ancient Kiev Rus kind of fell apart, the Duchy of Lithuania took control of all the western parts. So effectively, Duchy of Lithuania became the Russian state as well as the Duchy of Moscow was the Russian state. Okay, so the two of them had the same claim, but they controlled different parts of the territory. So the eastern parts was controlled by Duchy of Moscow, the western. We're talking again 13th century, right? Now, what happened is that at that time, now just to jump in back a little bit, of course, the Swedes, the Vikings originally, and the Slavic tribes themselves, they were pagan. But in the about 10th century mark, the Kiev Rus, all these lands of the Kiev Rus, they were effectively turned Christian. Now, of course, that process took much longer than just a year or two. Russia usually celebrates, and Ukraine actually as well, that celebrates that year. I believe it's 988 AD. But that's just a rough year. Of course, the process took much longer, probably centuries. By the time everybody was thought to be within the Christian state, with a Christian faith. Now, when the Duchy of Lithuania and Duchy of Moscow emerged, both states were primarily Orthodox. Now, when it comes to Moscow, it was entirely Orthodox, as far as we know. When it came to Lithuania, Lithuanians themselves, the rulers, were still pagans, or they were tending perhaps towards Catholicism, but the bulk of their people, they ruled. In fact, Lithuania at some point was the biggest country in Europe. I know it's not very well known because today Lithuania is a very small state, but at some point in time, like I said, in 13, 1400s, Lithuania was ginormous. And so Lithuanian people, majority of them were this former uh, subject of this ancient Rus state, and they were Orthodox. Now, Lithuanian elite themselves, they gradually kind of tended to the Catholic faith, and finally there was this reunification in 16th century between the Lithuanian state and the Polish state. I'm not going to go into the details, but just to tell you what happened. And at that point of time, all the people, all of a sudden, because Polish nation was very large, and so is there, and they were Catholic at the time. So as a result, it became automatically this Polish-Lithuanian state became a predominantly Catholic state. So all the subjects who were practicing Orthodoxy, the Eastern Slavs. Now, uh, Polish people and the Eastern Slavs, such as the former Rus and so forth, they're all related. They're not like completely different people, but the difference in religion made a huge split, and so majority of Poles were Catholic, and so this suddenly the Rus became a minority in that Polish-Lithuanian state and became effectively the other. So it's sort of like uh, in other words, the people to be subjugated, no longer were sort of in control. And that's where you see this the beginning of development of this sort of kind of proto-Ukrainian identity. Now, nobody would ever call it Ukrainian at that point in time, much less the people themselves. People themselves, in 16th century, for example, never referred to themselves as Ukrainian. They refer to themselves Ruski, Rus, something to do with the ancient toponym Rus, effectively, right? So did the people who were living in the Duchy of Moscow. So the people living in the Duchy of Moscow eventually would sort of become Russians, okay? But the people who were calling themselves by the same name within the confines of Polish-Lithuanian state would eventually become either Belarusian or Ukrainian or something like that. Okay, that's how identity was kind of formed, and the forming of identity became very strong because it related to Orthodox faith, which was a majority faith at some point in the Lithuanian state. It became a minority faith. Okay, so they were became much more subjugated. They were not given the same privileges. The Poles were ruling over them with time and everything else. So that how it developed sort of this original Russo-Polish conflict. Now, when I mean Russo, I mean actually Ruthenians or Ruski, people who occupied the Polish lands in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Okay, so this is how this identity was formed originally. Now, the term Ukraine, just so you know, Ukraine means in Slavic languages generally it means on the outer ridges or boundaries in the outer area. So when we're talking about Ukraine, Ukraine first emerged is literally the toponym. It's not the identification of people, but the toponym. So basically the southern reaches and the western reaches, they were Ukraine because they were on the edge of the sort of the Eastern Slav domain. They were people living on the edge. So there was not like we're not Russians, we're Ukrainians. No, no, no. There were Russians living on the edge of this sort of domain of this Eastern Slavs. Okay. Now, with time passing, what started happening is that in the state of Lithuania, there became a lot of conflict developed, and of course, conflict developed along the religious lines, right? Because the Orthodox minority now were constantly in some sort of conflict with religious majority, which were the Catholics, and there were different rebellions, there were massacres, there were all sorts of different oppressive mechanisms deployed in this set of relationship. Now, part of it was also the idea that, for example, some very smart people decided to create a syncretic religion. They decided to say, look, these people are Orthodox, but we better make them, we don't want to force convert them to Catholicism. We're just going to make them look like they're a little bit Catholic, okay? So what they did, they created this called Unia Church, which is actually very prevalent in Western Ukraine today. And that church effectively remained in Orthodox Church in name only. However, it adopted a lot of Catholic rites, and the most important thing, they they affirmed the primacy of the Pope. Okay, so that church was created in order to sort of extirpate this kind of smooth all these tensions that were between the Orthodox and the Catholics, and that also became one of the cornerstones of creation of this Western Ukrainian identity, because that Unia Church was only strong and viable only in the very western reaches of this common of this Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth Eastern Slav domains. Okay, the eastern part of it, the eastern people rebelled many times. One of the most famous rebellions were Khmelnytsky rebellion in the middle of the 17th century, and as a result of that rebellion and of course interference, because at the time the Duchy of Moscow was becoming very powerful, and so the Duchy of Moscow interfered in that conflict, and in fact because they saw an opportunity to take lands away from the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and also claim that they were essentially taking back the lands of the Kiev Rus, which they had lost. Now, it's a very contentious point, had they lost it or not, but the issue was, by the virtue of their relations to the Eastern Slavs who lived under Poland, and by the virtue of them being Orthodox, as well as those Slavs being Orthodox, it was a much better claim than the Polish claim to those domains. Okay, so it's just the way it was. Okay, this is not to say anybody was right or not. It's just medieval times. But the issue is that the match between the certain groups of people Of course, Eastern Slavs related to other Eastern Slavs much better than they're related to the Western Slavs, which were the Poles. Of course, they're related to Orthodox much better than they're related to the Catholics. Okay, so effectively, the eastern part of the Polish domains of Eastern Slavs was taken away from them by various uh, successive conflicts. For example, in one of the conflicts, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signed an eternal peace with the Duchy of Moscow, by which they gave Kiev to the Duchy of Moscow and a whole bunch of lands, basically along the Dnieper River, and they said to the left of it, okay, to the east of Dnieper River, all the way to Zaporozhye, which were the rapids, Dnieper Rapids. They don't exist anymore because they built dams there, but generally they used to exist, and that was kind of like the end of that outer outer uh, outer land of outer edge of the sort of Rus domains. That's what was Ukraine, right? Ukraine is toponym, is outer edge. The people themselves didn't call themselves Ukrainian. They called themselves generally Cossacks at the time, or they called themselves Ruski. Okay, Ruski, Russian, whatever. You can take it with a grain of salt if it's the same thing or not, but generally that's how identified. There was no identity such as Ukrainian. Okay, there were Ruski, there were Cossacks, there were Rus, there were Ruthenians, things like that. Okay, so that's how the Russian. So that we're talking about 17th century. Russia took control of that, and that was the origins of this sort of this Russo-Ukrainian identity that started developing in the central Ukraine. Now, of course, over time, the language obviously differs. Languages differ all the time. Take English. I mean, English from if you go from Brighton in the south. I mean, if you go all the way to Glasgow in the north or something like that, it's a completely different language. Okay, the same thing was happening with Slavic tribes as well. So of course, the language of the people who lived along the Dnieper River, of course, was different than people from in Moscow, but it was similar, but it was different. So that you could say, well, that was the origins of the formation of the Ukrainian language. Okay, but it was not never referred to Ukrainian. It was just thought to be sort of a dialect of the same Rus language at the time. Now, jump into this 18th century. Now, 18th century, Russia takes control of the right side of the Dnieper River as well from the Polish Commonwealth. Poland actually ceases to exist at the end of the 18th century. Okay, so this is how the Russian state effectively brings together the whole of central part of modern Ukraine, with the exception of Western Ukraine, which still remained at that time under the tutelage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, this is the part that remained always out of the Russian hands. But the central Ukraine, 18th century, completely taken over by the Russian Empire, and the sort of development and mixing of Russian nascent Ukrainian identity. Now, again, it wasn't called Ukrainian at the time. It was referred to. Russia gave the name to this polity as small Russia or Malorossia. Okay, so basically they were small Russians. Okay, so that's the identity they were using. Identity for the people, especially in the countryside, sometimes they were using. I would say this is a bit pejorative term, but it's mildly pejorative. It's not necessarily all that bad, but it is pejorative term. It's called chochol. Okay, so the people who are working the land, they were referred to as chochol or Malorussians. Okay, so that's primarily some of them, of course, some people who had family genealogy stemming from this Cossack state, the Cossacks who joined the Russian Empire in the 17th century, they called themselves Cossacks. That's how people generally identified. This is essentially Ukraine. Now, at this time in the 18th century, comes into play southeastern Ukraine. Now, you have to understand that majority of southeastern Ukrainian lands were really not occupied by Eastern Slavs up to that point. They were occupied a little bit, but very little population in the southern regions of it. There were primarily Tatar people who lived there. But the Russian state expanded, particularly under the Catherine the Great. Okay, and so this formation of the southeastern ridge of Ukraine today took place, including Crimea. Crimea was entirely Tatar, but of course, the Russian state took it over, and they obviously substituted the population, what might call today something like ethnic cleansing. Well, in part, it wasn't entirely ethnic cleansing, But that's what happened. And then, of course, a lot of people from the Russian Empire, from other parts of the Russian Empire, moved to the southeast. You have the port of Odessa, you have port of Ochakov, you have Nikolaev, you have Donetsk, which was actually developed by the Welsh merchant later on as a factory town. All those places, of course, not they're not just closer to Russia, but they're actually at that point they become populated with people who come in from all sides. They come in from central Ukraine, they come in from northern Russia, they come in from southern Russia. So this it becomes again the solidification of this identity, which is not very different from the rest of the Russian Empire, but has a bit of a flavor because again it's kind of moving westwards, and people coming from the central Ukraine also bringing this kind of this Malorussian Ukrainian flavor to it. So obviously this kind of solidification of this kind of mixed identity. Okay, so that's what took place all the way to formation of the Soviet Union, to the revolution, to the World War One, to the everything was kind of brought together exactly by this sort of forces. And of course, when the modern Ukrainian state today, some of the people who advocate for it, they would be saying something like, "Well, Crimea is Ukrainian." I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, you can say de jure in law, Crimea is Ukrainian, at least in part, because of course there was a vote and a referendum and so forth. But it's absolutely an impossible notion. There's no such thing that is historically Ukrainian Crimea, because, as I said, Crimea was Tatar, and most of these lands were either thinly populated by other tribes, such as again Tatars or Bulgars or Armenians or whatever, versus not populated at all somewhere, slightly north of the Azov Sea, for example, very little population because there were very long conflicts between various Tatar polities in the Russian state. That's why people didn't live there. That's why the Zaporozhye Cossacks, they only went to the rapids of the Dnieper River because past the rapids it was very difficult to attack. That's where they essentially put the stronghold Zaporozhye in. So yeah, that region was never in any fashion was attached to anything Polish Lithuanian at all. Like if you can say, well, central Ukraine emerged from Polish Lithuania, as I mentioned, but not southeastern Ukraine or Crimea. That's called Novorossiya, which is New Russia, and that part of the world was effectively developed by the Russian Empire at the expense of the Tatars and other people who lived there. This is not a judgment of any kind. I mean, this is just to say that's what happened. Okay, so those two identities, central Ukrainian identity and the southeastern identity, they kind of roll into this one idea around 19th century. What happened in the 19th century is very interesting because you had the great Napoleonic Wars, and they culminated in the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, and that's where essentially in European parlance, well, there's some people actually talking about the 30-year War and the Westphalian Treaty, but I think the Treaty of Vienna was a cornerstone of the European nation state. And that's where all this land, central Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine, Crimea, they're still very much in the Russian Empire. They're very central to the development of the Russian Empire. Emerge idea of a nation state. A nation state because, yeah, sure, there's this mixed identity. These people are somewhat different than people who live around Ryazan, for example, or people who live around St. Petersburg. I mean, they're different, right? So it develops this idea that and then of course there's this look back at the history of the Polish Commonwealth controlling large chunks of this land, and it emerges the idea that there should be some other state, which is the Ukrainian state. So it emerges the idea of this Ukrainian nationalism. Okay, so in 19th century, when it's the first time when the actual term Ukraine appears to be attached to people, so not just to sort of like the geography, the edge of the empire, but attached to people, and that it has some take in the Ukrainian society. There's no doubt about that, because the Russian Empire in general, not just with respect to Ukrainians or anything else, Russian Empire was very coercive. I mean, it was absolute empire, and of course they didn't like dissent, and of course people were looking for some other methods of governance, and of course nationalism emerged, and it was somewhat popular, but it never became mainstream really until the World War One. Okay, so until World War One, majority of people in this central southeastern Ukraine, they refer to themselves either Russian, Malorussian, Nova Russian, or they refer to themselves as Hohols, or some refer to Kazakhs. Okay, very few people actually call themselves Ukrainian, but then it took off. World War One, it really took off in that part of the world, and so from then on, you have the Ukrainian nationalists. So when it came time to develop the USSR, the first republics, right? Of course, there were attempts and there was establishment. There was actually existence of proto-Ukrainian states right in the wake of the World War One during the Russian Revolution and Civil War. There were Ukrainian states, right? And so there were Western Ukrainian states and Eastern Ukrainian states. So they existed and existed with the support of the German and Polish, but then eventually they folded. And so the Soviet Union took shape, and the Soviet Union, Lenin and his lieutenants, I mean, at the building of the Soviet Union, they decided that it was very important to maintain some flavor of national identity. And the reason was because without certain nationalist forces, they couldn't have actually sustained the revolutionary momentum. They couldn't have won the Civil War. They needed these people. So they decided, okay, we'll have the Russian USSR, SSR, we have the Belarusian SSR, and so forth. So it was kind of like a little bit of a give in to the nationalists in a way, nationalist ideas, I should say. Now, let's just bring back, slightly roll back to the idea of the Western Ukraine. Okay, what has been happening in Western Ukraine? Because remember, the central Ukraine came under the Russian Empire in the 17th, 18th century. Southeast was actually built by the Russian Empire, more or less at the expense of other people of non-Slavic origin. So what do we have with the Western Ukraine? Western Ukraine, we have solidification of that Ukrainian identity under whether with this Union Church, which was a hybrid between the Orthodox and the Catholic, or the Orthodox Church, they still remain the other, they still remain the minority, they still remain somewhat oppressed, but they never came under the control of the Russian Empire. They remained under either Polish control, or they went predominantly under, then parts of it went under the Polish control, the other parts went under, well, Austro-Hungarian and then Polish control again. It was they went under Austro-Hungary and then Poland again. So these people also, like the people in central Ukraine, they were always referring to themselves as Ruski, or Ruthenian. Okay, they were not referring themselves as Ukrainian. However, they were cut off from the rest of Eastern Slavs in central Ukraine and Russia and so forth. So they developed much stronger linguistic identity. Whereas, like again, like I said, in central Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine, the languages were fluid, mixed, country, city, depending where. Plus, you had all sorts of other like Mennonite farmers and so forth. I mean, there was this whole mix and a great multitude of different nationalities. There were, and the languages were always mixed, and of course, there was presence of Jewish people and so forth. When it came to Western Ukraine, this whole idea of this single separate identity was much more solidified. The idea of Russian language penetrating that part of the world was almost like foreign. I gave you an example. Once I was on the train in Vienna, and I started talking to this lady, and this lady was from Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. But Ukrainian diaspora, if anybody knows, is primarily based on immigrants from Western Ukraine. Okay, so she heard I was from Ukraine. She started talking Ukrainian to me. Now, my Ukrainian is a bit always rusty, so it's like I'm half Ukrainian, half Russian. I kind of mixed them all in. So that's how I was answering her. Now, had I been doing it in Ukraine, everybody would have understood me. There was not a problem. If I was speaking the Surgic, this dialect, sort of like this mixture of two languages, it would have been no problem in Ukraine whatsoever. People would have understood me anyway. They would have understood if I just spoke Russian to her. But because she was specifically from Western diaspora, she couldn't understand me. So we had to switch to, to English because here Ukrainian was like literally this kind of a pure Ukrainian versus mine. Okay. Now, so this identity came into being. The World War One happens, and the same thing. You have this idea now during the World War One scenario. The Austro-Hungarians realized that the people themselves, among themselves, start differentiating between who they were. Ukrainians, that's already 20th century. Ukrainians or Ruthenians or Ruski, okay? And they start persecuting the Ruski people because they figured those people were much more susceptible to Russian propaganda and aiding and abetting the Russian state, who was fighting Austro-Hungary in the World War One. Okay, So there was a lot of oppression against. In fact, there were actually concentration camps, and people were actually shot and killed for being Ruski. Okay, so that identity was kind of exterminated almost in Western Ukraine by these efforts. And of course, other people who may have decided to call themselves Ruski before, they're kind of like, what the heck? I'm not dying for it. I'm Ukrainian. Okay. And of course, this is how the word Ukrainian was very strongly, it became very strongly attached to the Western Ukrainian community. So they almost like within few decades, they were Ruski and they all became Ukrainians. Okay. And of course, then they were trying to establish the Western Ukrainian Republic. That was a failure. It ended up in Poland after World War One. So they didn't come into the USSR until 1939 when Stalin took over. Now, when Stalin took over, now in and of itself, it actually wasn't a particular tragedy for the Ukrainian people in the West. The problem was that Stalin himself was an oppressive tyrant, right? So he didn't tolerate any kind of dissent, and of course, he went after nationalists right away, and that created really, really bad sentiment. This is why today the part of Ukrainian identity is based in this Nazi mythology related to the Ukrainian Nazis who were fighting Stalin. But that's kind of like slightly different part of the story. But anyway, that's how it went. Now, with respect to the rest of Ukraine, so what ended up happening is that first the Bolsheviks, remember, they supported nationalists, so they allowed the establishment of ethnic republics. So the Bolsheviks decided that they needed to Ukrainize the population, because hey, you live in Ukrainian USSR, you better be Ukrainian. Why, don't pretend to be Russian. We're trying to create a slightly different identity. So they were trying to impose Ukrainization. In other words, they were start opening Ukrainian theaters, Ukrainian newspapers. They were making Ukrainian a much more prevalent language. Now that lasted throughout the 20s. But then when the Stalin finally solidified his rule in Moscow, it's all reverted. So it became Russification again. So all of a sudden, no. If you speak too much Ukrainian or nationalist, no, you better speak Russian. And yeah, sure, we'll have the Ukrainian theater still, and we still have Ukrainian newspaper, and we still have Ukrainian radio. But I think Russian is better. So there was like this pressure, right? But you have to understand, for people themselves within this cauldron, it doesn't really matter. People were flexible. I'm not talking about some activists. Obviously, Stalin persecuted some nationalists very harshly. But that's not to say majority of people, they just kind of move from one identity to another. It's very fluid. It's not a big deal. You just change it a little bit here, a little bit there. This is why sometimes it's very difficult to actually maintain records of who's Ukrainian, who's Russian. In the Soviet state, really tried to do that, because Soviet state always had documents that had ethnicity written in it, right? So this is how Soviet state preserved the Jews, so to speak, because they decided to write ethnicity in the document. So had the Jews not written their ethnicity, they would have well also became fully Russo Ukrainian. I mean, they were already full Russo Ukrainian, but it would have become even more so. Okay, so this is how the whole thing was developed. Now, unfortunately, this story is a little misunderstood in the West, and West has been fed a lot of propaganda on this regard. Now, the biggest piece of propaganda that would bring to your attention is so-called Holodomor. Okay, so Holodomor, it's a famine. Okay, and the famine, the causes of the famine were many, but the main cause of the famine was collectivization. So in other words, I mean, yeah, you could say, well, how collectivization? Collectivization was effectively Stalin's desire to industrialize the countryside. But of course, as you know, the farmers don't exactly work like the workers at the factory. They don't have the same ideas. They don't have the same, patterns of ownership of tools, of land, and so on and so forth. So there was great amount of resistance among the farmers. And the resistance was because the Soviet state, well, came to him and said, now you're not an individual farmer, you're a part of this factory, this agricultural factory, which is collective farm. And of course, resistance resulted in an armed resistance. There was a lot of persecution, armed persecution, both sides. I mean, the Soviets went under some of the activists, and some activists went under the Soviets. And of course, the state was much stronger and generally prevailed. But the issue is that the state decided to treat the whole enterprise of collective farming, or farming in general, as sort of this factory. So they said, look, You produce 100 widgets today, well, tomorrow you got to produce 105. That's how it works. But of course, agriculture, and especially at that time when there was still the use of fertilizers was extremely limited, if none, and so it was the harvests were variable. And so at one point in time in harvest in 1932 came to be very low. But of course, the Bolsheviks, they sent people to said, look, you produced 100 widgets yesterday, today you owe us 105. But they only had 95. Okay, so they started expropriating grain. As a result, millions of people across the USSR, across southern part of the USSR, which is Ukraine, Russia, and parts of Kazakhstan, died as a result of this idiotic mismanagement. In fact, but of course, the lines of communications at the time were completely different than this today. It's not social media that you find everything the next second. I mean, it took a while for the people in Moscow to realize what they've done. So by the time they reversed the grain flow, it was too late for millions of people that died. That's what actually happened. But the propaganda, particularly in the West, and it was picked up by the Western Ukrainian diaspora with great zest, was that it was an ethnic genocide of Russians against Ukrainians. Okay, and this part was I mean, the whole famine story of the famine was really under wraps during the Soviet Union. And it was, of course, a great mistake because the Soviets would have done well for themselves to actually come up and say, look, there was a great tragedy and mistake, and our leaders were to blame, right? But instead of that, they wrapped it under, they put it, swept it under the rug, and then when it came out, well, it came out ugly. This ugly story that Moscow, the ethnic communist Russians, decided to kill ethnic Ukrainians, which is complete nonsense. Now, it's a separate discussion, but I'm just giving you an idea how much has been injected since into this argument: who is Ukrainian, who is Russian, and what the difference is. Okay, so by the time you roll into after the World War II, now Western Ukraine is now a part of the Soviet Union. Okay, and not only it's a part of the Soviet Union, it's a very bitter part of the Soviet Union because they remember how Stalin treated Western Ukrainians when they rolled in 1939. So you have this very strong, and like I said, the way they developed away from the Russian Empire, the whole idea of this mixture with the Russians and so forth, and so the linguistic ideas, the political ideas, the cultural ideas of Western Ukraine, they were really at the core anything but Russian in some way, right? Although the language is of course very related and close, and the cultures are related, and it still remain majority Orthodox. But nevertheless, that whole formation became a very separate enterprise. Whereas the central Ukraine and southeastern Ukraine remain the sort of this base of this mixed Russian Ukrainian identity, and that's how essentially how we arrived when modern state of Ukraine was born. And of course, at that time, approximately three-quarters of the old Ukrainians spoke Russian as their first language, although not all of them considered Russian as a maternal tongue, but they spoke Russian as the first language. Okay, so a lot of them on the surveys, they would say, well, they um, Ukrainian language is their maternal language, but the first language they speak is Russian. And like I said, part of it was, of course, the Soviets that they preferred Russification to Ukrainization since the time of Stalin. So of course the pressure was always away from the Ukrainian language, although the Soviets tried to, in a way, to push Ukrainian language just as well. For example, when I was growing up, majority of books that you could buy at the bookstore, like for rare books, like for example, you wanted to buy some French romances, French novels, Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, whatever. These books were typically in short supply in Russian. It was very hard to find. But if you wanted to read in Ukrainian, there was not a problem. They were always in the bookstore. So in other words, Soviets were not completely sort of anti-Ukrainian as it typically referred to today. I mean, there was like mixed bag of policies. Some of them actually were very pro-Ukrainian. Like I said, there was no shortage of Ukrainian books, and there was always Ukrainian TV channel and things like that. But anyway, but identity was always remained mixed. Of course, we knew, for example, and of course, I understood it personally. For example, I recall my cousin coming from St. Petersburg for a visit, and we're sort of walking down the street, and we see this name, and it's a flower shop, right? And if flowers in Russian is цветы, but in Ukrainian it's kviti. And so she's like, "What's kviti?" She's like asking me. She doesn't understand, and I was explaining, "This is цветы. This is flowers." And she's like, oh, okay. So this is like, I'm just giving you an example, a flavor of what Russian Ukrainian identity is. It's like you're mixed, you can understand it. But she comes from St. Petersburg. She doesn't have that exposure. She doesn't understand it. You cannot call her Russo Ukrainian, although her, let's say, genetic roots were in that spectrum, but her effective cultural linguistic appearance was different. Okay. And that Russo-Ukrainian identity, like as I mentioned in my previous video, was not just occupying central and southeastern Ukraine, but also large parts of the southern Russia and western Russia as well. So it's not like something that was just strictly confined by the borders. This is just to my friends from the West who think that somehow border defines this identity in a very harsh and strict manner. Okay, so when it came to independent Ukraine, I mean, as I mentioned in the previous video, but the first mistake the Ukrainians made, of course, was to say, well, we're independent Ukraine, our state language is going to be one and only Ukrainian. Okay. Now, right away, you have this problem. Imagine you have 70% of people, let's say, speaking another language as their first preferred language, and all of a sudden they have to switch to another one. Now, again, in and of itself, maybe not a problem, but it definitely creates political friction. If that this is the reason why there's multilingual states exist. This is why Switzerland has 4 languages. This is why Belgium has 3. This is why Canada has 2. There is a reason for it, right? But of course, the modern Ukrainian state builders didn't want to do that. And that started kind of splitting the population. This whole language policy debate and language politics in the modern state of Ukraine became this hot potato by which it was not even a desire to speak one language or another. It became just a matter of separating people on the basis of politics. Okay. And so it's gotten to the point, to the absurdum. For example, like I might have in the previous video described an absurd situation when I was visiting my hometown just what is it, 3 years ago? No, I'm sorry, I apologize. 4 years ago, 2021, right before the start of the war, and still, we're talking central Ukraine, southeast a bit, but mostly central Ukraine. Majority of people still spoke mostly Russian on the street, and yet in any official capacity, even if going to the cafe, all of a sudden the personnel who also spoke Russian had to speak Ukrainian to you because there was an edict of the state. And of course, to add insult to injury, the Ukrainian state effectively uh, delegitimize the Russian language to the point that's considered a foreign language in Ukraine. Can you imagine? Like you literally, there's cities in Ukraine such as Odessa or whatever, even today, and you're walking around, everybody's speaking Ukrainian, but it's a language has no status whatsoever. It's a completely foreign language. Okay, so it's an absurd situation. But of course, politicians are using the situation. This is exactly why the modern Ukrainian state, as an anti-Russian enterprise, emerged because they had to suppress the Russo-Ukrainian identity and they had to raise the sort of uniquely Ukrainian identity. Of course, they created friction and discord and created Maidan and created an Orange Revolution and created civil war. But who ultimately cares? That's what happened. So what is it? And what's funny, what's interesting with this war, it's very interesting. But before I get into this, yeah, okay, let me mention. So with this war, okay, I personally have many people who went to school with me or I've known them since I was young, and our method of communications has always been Russian, always. Okay, now some of these people now prefer to speak and even write in Ukrainian, especially on Facebook, for example. You see people writing everything in Ukrainian, like, why are you writing in Ukrainian? Because most of your friends are just Russian speaking people. And this is people, of course, cracking under pressure. They're not because they all of a sudden love Ukrainian language. I'm not against Ukrainian language. I mean, if you wish, sure, you can speak, you can write it, you can completely sort of abandon the use of Russian or anything like that. But it's very funny when person sort of midlife or even later in life all of a sudden makes this decision. Of course, that has nothing to do with the love of language. It all has to do with the political pressure, right? So under political pressure, these people are switching, right? But still, majority of them remain Russian speakers. But they're also not pro-Putin at all. They hate Putin. I mean, of course, especially they hate Putin after 2022. And so when the certain Western experts, such as Jeffrey Sachs, as I mentioned, talk about Russian speakers and putting protection on Russian speakers, it's a bit of a joke because it has nothing to do with people speaking Russian, okay, or people speaking Ukrainian, okay. As I mentioned, this Russo Ukrainian identity still exists. It experienced significant pressures from the Ukrainian state, but it still exists. And then on the top of this identity, you can still build a different Ukrainian state. There would not be anti-Russian enterprise. There would not be anti-Polish enterprise. There would not be anti-American or anti-German or anti-Japanese. It would be a state that respects and values all backgrounds of all their citizens. But before we can get to that, let's just consider what are the other prospects, right? So, I mean, as this war continues, right, what is happening? Of course, the Western Ukrainian identity, the one that sort of feeds the rest of Ukraine with anti-Russian, background, some of it propaganda, some of it is facts, but of course, this is where the whole influence of the uh, World War II Nazis comes from as an example, right? And in Western Ukraine, I mean, it's completely normal occurrence. In fact, in the city of Lviv, I mean, there's every year there's a parade celebrating the Waffen SS Galichina, right? Every year they have a parade. It's completely normal. So, or it has been normalized, right? Of course, it's a little bit more difficult thing to sell in central and southeastern Ukraine, but nevertheless, that's what's happening. And of course, people live under that pressure. And so, Russo-Ukrainian identity, of course, is losing its power. In fact, it was never empowered since 1991, and it's kind of breaking up into pieces. So, what can we have? Potentially, we can have the Western Ukrainian idea of what Ukrainian is and what the person, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian politics, what Ukraine is obviously creeping eastwards. As the war progresses westwards, that is progressive, creeping eastwards. Now, success of that project obviously is determined to some extent by what Russia does, but also is determined by Western Ukraine. I'll explain to you why. Um, um, Western Ukrainians, they understand. Like when you might be talking to somebody, for example, in sort of like mainstream media, you hear in somebody from mainstream media, and you get this idea that Ukraine is sort of this homogeneous country, and nobody really rules the roost over one side or the other side. This is not true. And Western Ukrainians are completely cognizant of the fact that they drive this whole identity building agenda in Ukraine today. They do. Again, I'm not faulting them for it. That's just the way it is. But they're driving it. Okay, they're driving this World War II Nazi propaganda. They're driving imposition of different kind of Ukrainian language that is unknown in Central Ukraine, for example. A lot of words are brought into the language from Western parts of Ukraine for the specific purposes of exterminating. Uh, I mean, it's a bit strong word, but sort of like changing this identity in the Central Ukraine westwards. So that drive is there, and they kind of empower. On the other hand, a lot of people in Western Ukraine, particularly the most propagandized types, they're very fearful of people in Central and Eastern Ukraine. They don't trust them. They always suspect them to be sort of this proto-Russians or Russian spies. Sometimes they make fun of their language. Even let's say a person from my hometown goes to Western Ukraine, they even if he speaks Ukrainian, right, they determine to be sort of somewhat unreliable, kind of a different caste in a way. So that does happen. And so it's kind of like the way almost how you speak Ukrainian sometimes could be determined how much Ukrainian you are in this modern state, right? And then, of course, the worst sin one could commit is actually speak Russian. I dare anybody go to Lviv today and start asking anything in Russian, let's say in official, in some official establishment, even go to a restaurant. I would like to, I mean, people have been recorded. I mean, you go into these establishments and they're shouted at, sometimes their service is rejected. I mean, it does happen because Russian language has become de facto in persona non grata in sort of Western Ukraine. And it depends on this formation of this, eastward creeping of the Western Ukrainian identity in Ukraine, it's somewhat predicated on the ability of Western Ukrainians to accept, for sort of the central Ukrainians to pass, southeastern Ukrainians to pass the purity test if they're Ukrainian or not. So now, if that project succeeds, I'm afraid the whole conflict between Russia and Ukraine will continue. I don't know how long. I have no idea. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen 10 years from now. But unfortunately, I think it will remain a very heated conflict. If it's not military conflict, at least ideological conflict. The only way to, in my opinion, to bring the conflict back to some sort of normalcy and normalize the relationship between the countries has to build up the Russo Ukrainian identity. And I'm not saying that the Ukrainian state has to be joining Russian Federation or has to be joining Poland or whatever. All I'm saying, if you want to have an independent state, it has to address the needs, the cultural background, linguistic requirements, and effectively political orientation of all of the citizens. So that's another project. This is a Russo Ukrainian project. I hope that project could succeed. Doesn't look like it's going to succeed now, but who knows? I still believe there is a lot of foundation left. So hopefully this was has not been too long. I mean, it's been like an hour anyway. So I apologize. Have a nice day and enjoy your weekend. And maybe I'll come up with another topic and make video on something else related to this or some other thing. Anyway, thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe and have a great day. Thank you.